And we're going to look at this in several different ways. We're going to sort of isolate each of those parameters, the atrial pressure, ventricular pressure, the valves, and we'll talk about this and just reiterate how the cycle is affecting each of those parameters. But I'll pause here briefly for any questions on that so far, on any of the four phases. All right. So let's look at the atrial and ventricular pressures and how those are changing. So in phase one, the atrial pressure is rising slowly with the filling of blood. Okay. The ventricular pressure starts low because there's not yet enough blood in that chamber. And then there's a small rise in the ventricular pressure due to the atrial contraction. So as we mentioned before, towards the end of phase one, so kind of at the middle point towards the latter half of phase one, the atrials start to contract to squeeze that last bit of blood out of the chamber. And so that is responsible for both the rise in pressure of the atria and the ventricle towards the end of phase one. Okay, we can see that happening here. Now, when we get to the start of phase two, okay, I apologize. I think my screen froze a bit. Hopefully everyone can still see and hear me. So when we get to phase two, now we have a increase in ventricular pressure as the ventricle starts to contract. Atrial pressure will drop off as the AV valves close. And so that is the brief period of phase two. In this phase, the pressure steeply rises in preparation for ventricular systole or ejection. Okay. Phase three is ventricular ejection. So as we would expect, because blood is leaving the ventricular pressure falls. It starts high with the contraction of that chamber, but then drops off as blood leaves the chamber. Atrial pressure falls further until the end of systole. So the atrial pressure will continue to dip as the atria begin to relax in this stage, while the ventricles are in their contraction phase. So this is ventricular contraction. Simultaneously, we have atrial repolarization. Okay. And then phase four, this is when we get into diastole. So in this phase, we have the AV valves closed. The semilunar valves are also closed in phase four. And blood here is not moving. So this in phase four, blood is not moving. But when we get back to diastole, which is phase one, now we're going to see blood move as we go from the end of phase four, isovolumetric relaxation, to opening up of the AV valves and the spilling of blood to start the new cardiac cycle. Okay. If we think about what's happening in the aorta during diastole, however, the aortic valves are going to be closed. So when the ventricle is filling, the semilunar valves are closed. And that would be consistent with this would be consistent with the start of phase one. Okay, the aortic valve is closed. The blood is still leaving the aorta, so it's still moving away, so the pressure is going to begin to fall here. And at the lowest point of that pressure, that is called diastolic pressure. So diastolic pressure is right down here, right? This line here, and that's about 70 millimeters of mercury. And this is going to be the lowest point of the pressure in the ventricle. And this is while it is sort of filling here, at the end of filling. Now we can look at the systolic pressure, what happens during systole. So during systole, blood is being ejected from the ventricle. Remember, diastole and systole are from the perspective of the ventricle. So blood is leaving the ventricle, moving out into the aorta, and so the aorta valve and semilunar valve, both valves are open. That would be corresponding to phase 3. Pressure is going to rise as the ventricle contracts, but then rapidly drops off as the blood is ejected. Now, here we can measure the very peak of phase 3 or ventricular systole. We can record the systolic pressure. It's the highest pressure recorded in the ventricle, and that is at the peak of phase 3. Towards the end of that now, the aortic valves will close. And because there's a bit of backflow of blood, so as the valves close, there's a small bit of blood that sort of backflows against the closing valve, and that slightly rises the pressure. So there's a bump in the pressure as that blood hits the back of the closing valve, and that is responsible for what we call the dichotic notch in the pressure of the aorta. Okay, so there's sort of a spike here in the pressure of the aorta, which is due to the backflow of blood against the closing valve. All right, so that is how the pressure of the aorta changes. It's low in diastole, right, because the semilunar valves are closed. It is high in systole, because this valve is open, and then it drops off towards the end of systole. Now, this is where we get our blood pressure readings from, right? This is the pressure in the aorta, and this is going to be the same as the pressure that we can detect in any of our peripheral vessels. So your systolic pressure is your top number in blood pressure, which is usually up at about 110, so that's kind of standard for an average adult. It can go higher to about 120 or 130. And then the lower pressure is the diastolic pressure, which is down here at 70. Again, this can be higher depending on your cardiovascular state, age, gender, etc. But anywhere between 70 and 90 is a reasonable blood pressure. Children will usually have higher blood pressures than these readings. Okay. Let's talk about the mean arterial pressure, right? And kind of going back to this curve here, the mean arterial pressure is sort of an average between these two numbers, but it can tell us a lot about your overall cardiovascular health and your overall vascular flow. So the mean arterial pressure is the average aortic pressure occurring during the cardiac cycle. So if you look at the pressure across the entire cycle, lowest being diastole, highest being systole, and we took an average of that number. That tells us the average driving force that is pushing blood through your entire systemic circulation. Okay, that's a very meaningful number clinically. It's gonna be reliant upon continuous blood during the cardiac cycle. So even though your valves have closed, you should be able to maintain pressure and therefore flow throughout all periods of the cardiac cycle, right? That's going to ensure that you have good perfusion to your tissues even while the valves have closed. Now, the way that we get this continuous flow is because of the nature of the aorta. The aorta is a large elastic artery. It's got lots of elastic fibers. It's very stretchy and malleable. And what that does is it creates a pressure reservoir. So because it's quite stretchy and elastic, it can trap or capture pressure when it expands during systole. So what happens is we store some of that energy in the elastic walls of the aorta while the ventricle is ejecting, while blood is moving through the artery, and while the artery is expanding. We can then release that pressure when the valve closes and we're no longer receiving blood into the aorta. We can now recoil the aorta and release that pressure to keep flow through the aorta and out to the peripheral tissues constant through all periods of the cardiac cycle. So the stretchy and elastic nature of the aorta specifically, but also to some extent the pulmonary artery, is what helps to maintain blood flow consistently throughout all periods of the cardiac cycle. Okay, so let's illustrate that here. So we have systole, which is ventricular ejection. And notice that the AV valves are not AV, excuse me, semilunar valves are open here. So blood is flowing from the left ventricle specifically out into the aorta. And while it's doing that, the stretch of the aorta, the expansion of the aorta, is capturing the pressure in the walls of the vessel. And so blood can flow out to systemic arteries, but we also want to trap some of that energy in the wall of the expanding vessel. Now, during diastole, when the valve closes, right, the ventricle is relaxing, so the AV valves are open, the aortic valve here is closed. Now we can recoil that elastic vessel, and we can use that as a means of pressure to exert on the blood that's sitting in this vessel to keep flow constant, even though the semilunar valve is now closed. So the take-home message here is that even though the valve is closed, we still maintain adequate flow in both scenarios because of this nature of the elasticity of the aorta. Okay, so these can act as pressure reservoirs. Now let's talk about the ventricular volume. So the volume of the ventricle, that's going to change when we're in diastole versus systole. And there are certain specific volumes that we want to describe and identify. So the end diastolic volume, the EDV, this is the amount of blood in the ventricle at the end of diastole. So diastole is the filling of the ventricle. And when we have filled the ventricle completely and the AV valves close, how much blood is now sitting in that chamber at the end of that ventricular filling? That is our EDV. Okay. Our ESV, or end systolic volume is going to be the opposite of that. So when blood has left the ventricle, we have ejected blood out into the arteries, and now the semilunar valve closed. What is the volume of blood left in that chamber at the end of systole, right? It's really important to point out here that the ventricle does not completely empty, right? It never completely empties. There's always some blood left at the end of systole that is going to stay in the chamber and kind of never fully empties the chamber. Now, when can we identify these two volumes, right? Because if we're looking at the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume, we want to think about what phase of the cardiac cycle would allow us to be able to calculate these volumes. So what do we think here? When do you think we'd be able to calculate the end diastolic and end systolic volumes? What phases of the cardiac cycle? When do you think we'd be able to measure these volumes? Okay, so I'm seeing end of systole and end of diastole. So that is correct. That would be the end of systole, which is the ending of phase one. We would be able to tell the end diastolic volume at the end of phase one. Very correct. And we'd be able to tell the end of systole at the end of phase three. Okay, so just to go back here, I really want to point this out. If we look at our phases, the end of phase one is when we have the lowest aortic pressure, but the highest, oh no, this is pressure, sorry, we want to look at volume. Okay, so this is going to tell us volume. So the end of systole is when we have the highest ventricular volume, right? This is when the ventricle has filled and now it is full of blood. And in fact, the volume stays the same even through phase two. So we can detect the end diastolic volume at the end of phase one or even throughout phase two because the volume stays the same in phase two. We can detect the end systolic volume at the end of phase three when the volume has dropped, right? The ventricle has ejected that blood. And so at the end of phase three or even throughout phase four, we can detect the end systolic volume. Now, the other two volumes we want to think about are stroke volume. So stroke volume is basically the amount of blood ejected from the chamber. And this is not a measured volume. This is a calculated volume. So if we have end diastolic volume, the total amount filled, and we have end systolic volume, the total amount after we eject, we can measure or calculate how much was actually ejected. So that is our stroke volume. So if we have filled 130 milliliters at the end of diastole, and we have 60 milliliters after blood is ejected, this is remaining in the ventricle, then that means we have ejected 70 milliliters. So that would be our stroke volume. Okay. On that basis, we can also begin to think about the ejection fraction. So this is a fraction at the end of the diastolic volume, and it's how much of the end diastolic volume was ejected during a heartbeat. So this is now a ratio, right? A fraction. So it is our stroke volume divided by our end diastolic volume. So of the total amount that we filled, how much, what percentage, what fraction of that was ejected? And that would be our ejection fraction. So it's about 70 mLs being ejected during systole. About 130 mLs were filled at the end of diastole to begin with. And so the fraction of that is 0.54 or 54% was ejected at rest. Now this can go higher if you're exercising or if you're under exertion. You can eject more of your total volume filled during additional states, but at rest, you typically eject about 54% of that blood during systole. Okay, which is quite fascinating. So only about half of the blood is leaving the chamber, and about half of it, a little under half of it, is actually staying back in the chamber. Right? Really fascinating. Okay, so just to identify those volume changes here, and then how they kind of match with the cardiac cycles up here. So we have the start of our atrial contraction, and this is also corresponding to the filling of blood, right? We have phase one here. We begin filling blood, and then that becomes more of a contraction towards the end. And now at the end of phase one and throughout phase two, we have the highest total volume in our ventricle, and that is 130 mLs or our end diastolic volume. Now, as phase three begins, we eject that blood. So now blood drops off, volume is dropping. And now we're going back down to our end systolic volume, which is the end of phase three. And then that stays the same throughout phase four. Okay. Now, what the difference is here is our stroke volume. So our stroke volume is this differential. How much of this blood was actually ejected? Right? It's not all of it because now we have 60 mLs remaining, but then the majority of it, about 60% or 54% of it, as we just calculated, is ejected. And so that is going to be the drop-off that we see. And now we have the new phase starting here again, where we have the volume beginning to rise as we begin ventricular diastole, and we go back up to 130. So this is how blood is moving in and out of the ventricle, right? It's not completely emptying, but we're filling about to 130 mLs, which means that we're filling about 70 mLs on top of the reserve, and then we're ejecting that 70 mLs, right? So there's always some blood in the chamber.